national training and development curriculum for foster and adoptive parents.
Starting in infancy, children discover the world through their senses. But sometimes a child has difficulty interpreting the information that comes in through the senses. When this happens, it can interfere with the child's ability to learn, play, and form relationships. In this video, we will learn the definitions of sensory integration and sensory processing disorder. We will discover what parents can do to recognize and accommodate their children's sensory needs, and we'll learn strategies for helping children manage sensory challenges. We'll hear from a pediatrician specializing in adoption to learn the basics of sensory integration and sensory processing disorder. Learn from an occupational therapist and an adoption specialist how to identify and manage sensory processing issues in children. And we'll visit with the DeMarco family to discover firsthand how parents can help children adapt to and even overcome sensory challenges. We begin with definitions to better understand how some children experience the world. In the 1960s, occupational therapist and educational psychologist Jean Ayers introduced the theory of sensory integration, the process of taking information in through our senses, and then registering, organizing, and responding appropriately to that information. Jean Ayers also coined the term sensory integration dysfunction, now known as sensory processing disorder, or SPD, a condition in which the brain has trouble receiving, organizing, and responding appropriately to information that comes in through the senses.
Jamie Fleming, occupational therapist.
We all complete or perform sensory integration on an everyday basis. We take in sensory information from our environment on a constant basis throughout the day, and our brain processes and organizes that information, and then we act accordingly.
There are 5 external senses: vision, hearing, smell, taste, and touch, that receive and interpret information from the environment constantly. But there are also the less familiar internal senses: the vestibular sense, located in the inner ear, and proprioception, located in the muscles and joints.
Each of your sensory systems has receptors. Most of them make sense for the external senses, so visual input, the receptors are in the eye. Auditory input, the receptors are in the ear. Tactile input, the receptors are on the skin. The internal senses, or sometimes they're referred to as the hidden senses, would be where the information is coming from the inside of the body. So vestibular is movement, and those sensory systems would be in the inner ear canal.
Terry DeMarco, adoptive parent.
The vestibular sense is your sense of where you are on the earth. So vestibular input might be things like being on a swing, or just rocking, or rolling around on a funny shaped ball.
Proprioceptive input is input into the muscles and the joints. So anytime we push or pull or put tension on the muscles and joints, we activate the proprioceptive system.
Parents who are attuned to their children learn to recognize signs that they may be overstimulated or understimulated. It's helpful to know that a child's responses to sensory input fall on a continuum. In fact, this is true of everyone's response to sensory input.
A parent talks to their child who is curled up in a blanket on the couch.
Take a couple of big breaths, calm your body.
We all have preferences and non-preferences. We all have dislikes and likes, and we all have thresholds for how much sensory information we can tolerate.
The best way that it was explained to me that made it the easiest to understand was that each person has a cup to hold each sense. And some people's cup for each sense is really big, and some people's cup is really small. And once the cup is full, then they've had really all that they can take of that sense, and they can't take any more. And some people might have big cups for every single sense, or little cups for every single sense. And some people might have big ones for some senses and small ones for others. So you might be able to handle all the noise input in the world with no problem, but not be able to handle certain kinds of touch at all.
Most people learn to adapt to the sensory input they receive. If there are sensations we don't like, we learn to avoid them, or find ways to alter the environment, or take steps to lessen the effects of unwanted sensory input. Likewise, most of us find ways to get the sensory input we crave. When a child's inability to handle sensory input interferes with day-to-day functioning, it could signal a sensory processing problem. Pediatrician Dr. Dana Johnson specializes in the unique health needs of adopted children. He spoke with us about what happens when a child is unable to process sensory information in the usual way.
Dana Johnson, MD, PhD, Professor of Pediatrics, University of Minnesota, founder, Adoption Medicine Clinic.
Children with sensory integration challenges can manifest a number of different behaviors because they're not perceiving the world the way that a normal child would perceive the world.
We have children who over-respond to sensory information. We have children who under-respond to sensory information, and then we have sensory cravers or sensory seekers.
Some children are sensory seeking. They're crashing around in the house. They're running up against the wall. They're falling down. They're sitting in a chair, spinning around as fast as they can.
Or instead of giving you a typical hug, he would run and crash into me with all his might.
They may like loud noises. They may like to bang their toys. They like to touch everything with their hands because they're constantly seeking out tactile input. And they may be more rough and tumble.
A child runs through the house and jumps on the couch to join his parent and sibling who are looking at photos on a phone.
It's like I'm just the only target. I'm trying to get spotted, but see, everyone's hitting me.
Those are kids whose sensory systems need a ton of sensory information, much more information than most kids would need. So their thresholds are very high.
There are other kids who are exquisitely sensory sensitive.
So those kids would overreact to the sensory information they are receiving.
They don't like loud noise. They don't like lights. They have a very difficult time being in a crowd.
They may not like to be touched, or certain textures may bother them.
So for instance, they hate the tags in the back of their clothing. They hate either having their socks on or they hate having their socks off. They won't walk on the grass because it feels so icky to them.
So avoiding that sensory input is almost like a defense strategy for them. If the sensory information I'm getting is too much for me, then my reaction to that would be to try to get away from it.
Most parents can recognize the signs of sensory seeking or sensory avoiding behavior. The third subcategory, sensory under-responsive, can be harder to identify.
The kids who are under-responsive tend to kind of sit back and they don't interact with their environment because they're not getting enough stimulation to cause them to want to interact with their environment. Your under-responsive kid just kind of goes with the flow and they prefer sedentary activities. So they're quote-unquote easy kids, and they often get overlooked or missed.
As we've seen, there are different types of sensory processing issues, but children don't necessarily fit neatly into any one of these categories.
Children can have any one of those things or all of those things as part of their sensory integration problem. If you're seeing these sensory problems interfere with normal activities, with normal development, with normal social situations, those are the situations you should have evaluated.
In this segment, we discover what parents can do to meet their child's sensory needs. All children need sensory-rich experiences that engage all of their senses from the very beginning. That's exactly what happens for a baby when a parent holds and rocks them, gazes into their eyes, talks to them, feeds them, and shows them the world. A child who doesn't get enough sensory stimulation or has had adverse experiences in early childhood is more likely to have sensory processing difficulties.
Megan DeMarion, Adoption Program Supervisor, Three Rivers Adoption Council.
Sometimes we have to play a sensory detective to really figure out what is going on with the kids. So I recommend journaling what's going on.
So if you're having trouble the moment he gets off the bus, for instance, then over the next few days, be really intentional about paying attention to what's going on as he exits the bus. Even take notes.
A child's sensory processing issues may be magnified during stressful times. Parents can anticipate and plan for these times.
So becoming a sensory detective is figuring out what times of day is this happening? Is it before bedtime? Is it before breakfast? Is this before we have blood sugar regulated? When am I realizing that my child is having too many sensory experiences and they shut down or they hide? Sometimes it's hard to tell the difference between a misbehavior and a sensory seeking behavior or a sensory avoidant behavior. A child might be crashing into all the other kids in line at school, and we might see that as the child misbehaving or being bad, whereas they're trying to get the deep pressure that might be involved in crashing into someone. So becoming a sensory detective is helping your child to figure out their needs, but also you as the caregiver figuring out what they need to best be successful in that environment.
To maximize a child's success, parents can introduce what is known as a sensory diet, the activities and adaptations that provide children with the sensory input they need and mitigate the effects of the sensory input that distracts or overwhelms them.
A sensory diet is often created in partnership with an occupational therapist based on sensory integration theory.
Tim and Terry DeMarco are the parents of 5 adopted children. While they're quick to point out that they are not experts in the science of sensory integration, they are experts in their children's needs. They first learned about sensory processing issues out of their strong desire to help their youngest children, twins who are now 5 years old.
We got Jeremiah one day and the twins the next. He was 4 and they were 11 weeks old. We were referred to an occupational therapist because the babies were very difficult to soothe. It was very upsetting. I loved them very much and I wanted to give them my best and to be able to help them to be content and happy and to have what they needed to learn and grow, and I could not calm them. Now I see that we have sensory issues going on in every single person in our family, but then I didn't know anything about it.
The DeMarco's occupational therapist helped them create a sensory diet for each of their children. Sensory diets are as individual as children are. Think of the sensory diet as a variety of options on a mix and match menu. For example, with a sensory-seeking child who feels the need to hit or crash into things, the sensory diet might include a pillow mountain or a punching bag. A child who craves tactile input might enjoy finger painting or Play-Doh. Parents can help an over-responsive child by introducing noise-canceling headphones or tagless clothing or a dimmer switch. A balanced sensory diet for the over-responder would also include activities that increase the child's threshold for sensory input. For an under-responsive child, one who moves slowly in the morning, for example, 10 jumping jacks followed by an invigorating shower could be added to the sensory diet. There's plenty of variety in the sensory diets the DeMarcos created for each of their children.
The things that we do really depend on which child it is and which need that we're talking about. If I see my child acting out, I'm going to relate it to a need that they have. A lot of times that's going to be a sensory need. One of the things that I do to help prevent meltdowns is just to make sure that my kids have access to a lot of different things that would fall into a sensory diet. So they have access to things that are slimy and to things that are wet and to bouncy balls and to weighted blankets and things that have nice smells. We have a bouncy ball that's in the shape of a peanut, which is excellent for vestibular input. My daughter loves tactile input, so she loves to do things like play with slime or Play-Doh or put lotion on her hands. We use water in many different ways. We have a slip and slide, we have a really fun sprinkler, a kiddie pool, and obviously bath time. Whenever a kid is crabby, water is always a great tool to use.
In this home, implementing a sensory diet doesn't take away from family time. It shapes family time.
The DeMarcos sit at a kitchen table interacting with their children who are playing with modeling clay.
What is that?
That's my duck.
Oh, quack, quack. Make more and make more.
Sensory activities serve the dual purpose of meeting the children's sensory needs and building attachments.
Tim DeMarco and children bounce and pass an inflatable peanut to each other.
In this segment, we focus on some of the sensory challenges that can be present at mealtime, school, and bedtime, along with strategies for success as you encounter each challenge.
There's a lot of sensory processing difficulties related around mealtime. Kids can have issues with how the food looks. Kids can have issues with how the food feels on their hands. The other thing is sometimes the kids get the food in their mouth and they don't like the texture of the food. It can even be auditory. Like some kids don't like how the food sounds as they're crunching it. And then the other big thing with auditory is the mealtime experience itself.
It's louder. There are more people making noise cutting their food or chewing their food. There's more conversations. There might be 2 conversations happening at once.
Some children have a hard time sitting still and staying at the table, making it difficult for the family to eat a meal together.
So we can put kids on sit and move cushions where they can sit in their seat and kind of get that extra input. We can keep their hands busy with fidget toys, so maybe they're squeezing a fidget toy while they're eating. And all that can be going on and the child can still eat at the same time and everyone's happy.
School can be especially challenging for children with sensory processing difficulties.
Every part of their day involves so much sensory information. To learn, we need to be in a state of regulation. So what I mean by that is we can't be worried about and distracted by our clothing or the chair that I'm sitting in or the noise that I'm hearing in the background, because that all would interfere with my learning.
In school, you might see a kid squirming, having a hard time holding still in his seat. They might just really have a hard time staying focused.
So then they're up and they're down and they're in and out of their seats. But what that interferes with, whether it's the over-responder or the under-responder or the sensory seeker, is their learning.
It's really important that we are our children's advocates at school.
A caregiver knows their child best and their child's needs best. So in partnering with the teacher at school, the parent can talk to that teacher about how to help that kid be most successful in that classroom.
Children with sensory processing disorder may qualify for accommodations under an IEP or 504 plan.
Individual with Disabilities Education Act, or IDEA, IEP plans cover students who qualify for special education. Section 504 covers students who don't meet the criteria for special education, but who still require some accommodations. Both IEPs and 504 plans ensure the students with disabilities have equal access to a free and appropriate public education.
So that might talk about seating accommodations, that might talk about when the child's allowed to have a snack. They can have a wiggle seat or a sensory seat, a weighted lap pad. We can have certain fidgets that are either hidden within the desk, so Velcro strips, both the crunchier side and the smoother side, that they can feel the different sensations, or something that's really smooth that they can touch, or a worry stone inside of their desk. So you can get really creative and really advocate for what your kids' needs are and see how the school can meet you to get those kids' needs met.
Bedtime and sleep can be especially challenging for children with sensory processing issues.
Sometimes our kids have trouble falling asleep. They have trouble kind of regulating themselves and calming themselves to be able to get to sleep. So we always recommend routine, and we try to pick calming routines. So, maybe we get a bath if that's calming for the child, and then we read a story. We can use weighted blankets with kids that has a calming effect and can help kids stay asleep. Now, some of our kids, especially our sensory seeking and craving kids, actually need a lot of input prior to going to bed, and then we want to follow that with some organizing and calming input. So maybe we get a lot of physical activity by playing outside, before bedtime, or we can, maybe do some massage or squishing with pillows.
The DeMarcos are getting their children ready for bed. One child is squishing a pillow.
Daddy, squish.
Another fun thing that we do is at night, a calming activity, just gentle massage. I will just gently squeeze arms and legs from the top to the bottom and gently rub backs. We can also do things like a pillow sandwich, where the child is the filling between the pillows, and we give gentle pressure, just as much as they want, and I let them guide me.
That feels good. Does it? Yeah.
And that gives them a voice, teaches them to use their voice for when they've had enough and for when they want more, and as well as gives them sensory input. We do the same kind of input by wrapping them up in a blanket like a burrito, and then we we make them into a burrito, like by putting beans and lettuce.
Terry makes different touching hand motions to represent the different foods.
Some sour cream.
You want me to, we're doing calm squish time. You want me to wrap you up like a burrito?
Sure. What else?
Tomatoes.
Some tomatoes.
As rewarding as it is, parenting children with sensory processing needs can be challenging. Parents need support.
We need a team of people around us. It's not just us. We cannot do this alone.
As with many aspects of foster care and adoption, parenting children with sensory processing issues requires different parenting tools.
Not you, not you.
Not me.
Not daddy either.
Do you want mommy or daddy?
Yeah.
Instead of just trying to mold them into, giving me better behavior or getting better grades in school, we really have to have a healing heart, the heart of a healer, in order to do them any good. We have to meet their needs, and we have to help them. We have to help their hearts to heal.
This video was funded by the Children's Bureau, Administration on Children, Youth, and Families, Administration for Children and Families, U.S. Department of Health and Human Services, under grant number 90CO1134. The contents of this video are solely the responsibility of the authors and do not necessarily represent the official views of the Children's Bureau.